This evening, we are hosting renowned political scientist and academic, Professor Norman Finkelstein, for a part of his UK talk. He is a speaker in great demand, and in the past 3 days he's already been in Belfast, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Henley. Early in his career, he enjoyed much in bringing to life academic thought. However, following this, he has had a distinguished and prolific career, and he has been known for his forensic scholarship, probity, and academic rigor in championing the causes of the oppressed. We are truly honoured to have Professor Norman Finkelstein, and without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Norman.
Very good.
Well, thank you for having me here this evening. I was on time. I was actually well ahead of time. That's a Jewish characteristic, to always be on time. The only two ethnic groups which are consistently on time are Jews and Germans, which is why historically we've gotten along so well. But they asked me to delay it by a couple of hours so we can be an hour time. Well, thank you again, and I'll be doing something this evening which I usually don't do. I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict now. This year marks the 30th year. I first got involved in June 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And it was a pretty awful invasion. Between June and the late September 1982, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians. I started out then, and after a sobering 30 years, I'm still at it. Some people think that the fact that I'm still at it must demonstrate that Israel is some sort of obsession, fixation, or even fix of mine. But in actuality, I think there is a much simpler explanation. The explanation is the conflict hasn't found a resolution. There are many other conflicts in the interim that have found some sort of settlement. And I have no doubt that if this conflict found a resolution, that I would probably move on to something else. But it goes on, and so long as it goes on, I do have a stubborn streak. I continue at it. But in the past 3 decades or so, my modus operandi has been pretty straightforward and simple. I simply, depending on the events of the day, I simply juxtapose, I place side by side the historical record, the human rights record, the scholarly record on the one hand, and then this record as it's presented by Israel and Israel's supporters. And it's pretty easy to demonstrate that a huge chasm and abyss separates what the actual record shows and this record as it's distilled by Israel and its supporters. But this year I decided that I'm not going to take that approach for a couple of reasons, interrelated reasons. The first reason is it's really become superfluous, it's become unnecessary to demonstrate that the picture is much uglier than the one that Israel presents. Because now there is a broad public, which is reasonably knowledgeable about what's going on in that corner of the world, and that Israel bears a significant burden of responsibility, of culpability for what's going on there and all the ugly things that are happening. And so to go through the record again now, especially in an audience like this, which I take to be reasonably informed, otherwise presumably wouldn't be here, to go through the record now, it just seems to me a kind of gratuitous, if I can use the expression, a gratuitous Israel bashing. It's unnecessary. And I kind of like an intellectual challenge. And the intellectual challenge in the current political climate, the intellectual challenge is trying to make a case for Israel, not making a case against it. Making a case against Israel now is pretty easy. In fact, for example, in the afternoon, I spoke at Henley College, and there was young people, I guess ages 17 to 19, and at the end, a very intelligent young man came up to me, and he came to dispute some of the statements that I made. And at some point, I said to him, I assume you're Jewish. And he said, well, yeah, how did you know that? And I said, because nobody defends Israel nowadays anymore except Jews. The broad public will not defend its actions. And so it doesn't seem to me a useful exercise or a useful taking of your time to go through that record yet again. The second reason I'm not doing it is because I do think there is now a possibility, not necessarily a probability, and not necessarily a certainty, but there is a possibility now that we can find a resolution of the conflict, that we can finally remove the Israel-Palestine conflict from the pages of current events and to put it where it actually belongs, maybe in the pages of the history book. There is a possibility to resolve the conflict. But in order to achieve that resolution, we have to, first of all, present a clear goal. What do we want to achieve? Because if the public is ready to listen now, then we have to show them there is a way out. Because if you don't show them the way out, the public grows frustrated, it becomes exasperated, and it throws its collective hands up in despair, and it moves on. You lose them. You have to show the public, which is now dissatisfied with what's going on there, and additionally, recognizes that Israel bears a significant burden of responsibility for what's going on there, you have to show them there's a way out. Number two, our own, if you want to use the term, solidarity movement, it has to change its mindset. Because I think even in the solidarity movement, my experience over several decades is, no one really believes that a conflict can be resolved. It's a kind of eternal vigilance and eternal bearing of witness, or an eternal shouting at the top of your lungs how angry you are at the way Israel carries on. But the actual belief that in fact this conflict can come to an end if we're willing to give our all, and that last final push to finally get ourselves over the finishing line and resolve the conflict. I don't think the mindset is there now. And unless that mindset is there, I don't think people will be willing to give of themselves what's needed to be given to that final push to get over. And then, if we want to speak honestly and candidly, one of the many drawbacks of a conflict that's gone on so long is that people develop a stake in its perpetuation. It becomes your job. It becomes your raison d'etre, or your reason of being. There's a kind of fear of getting up in the morning and there's no Israel-Palestine conflict. How am I going to earn my living? How am I going to find a purpose in life? This character in the Palestinian Authority goes by the name of Saad Erekat. He calls himself a professional peace processor. That's his job. Some people are word processors. He is a peace processor. And this stake in the perpetuation of the conflict obviously acts as a kind of mental and psychological brake on wanting to see it actually resolved and settled. And so for those reasons, I've chosen to use this evening, as many others in recent months, to focus on what I take to be, for reasons which I'll get to in a moment, the most basic question. What are we going to tell the public is our solution to the conflict? And as I said, I think now more than ever, there are real prospects of settling it. First and most obviously, the recent developments preceding and then climaxing in what has come to be called the Arab Spring. In the course of the past 2 or 3 years, Israel has lost its 2 major allies in the Muslim Arab world. The longest ally of Israel over the longest period of time has been Turkey in the Muslim world. And under the recent accession to power of Prime Minister Erdogan, Israel can no longer count on Turkey as being a loyal and stable ally. That is not to say that the two countries are on a collision course or that there aren't areas of cooperation between them. In fact, significant areas of cooperation. But it is to say that Prime Minister Erdogan, he is a politician, and he recognizes that the Palestine cause has resonance in the Arab-Muslim world, and he has elected to champion that cause, much more admittedly in words than in actions. There's a huge gap between Mr. Erdogan's bark and his bite, but it's still true to say that he has become a pinprick of Israel's side on the question of the Palestinians, and also on his insistence on trying to resolve the conflict. And in the Arab world, Israel's chief ally was, of course, for the past 30 years, Egypt. And one of the consequences of the Arab Spring is that Israel can no longer count on Egypt as being a reliable and stable collaborator in the region. Exactly how much tension, how much friction, and how much conflict will unfold between Egypt and Israel, it's still a matter of speculation. The Arab Spring is still very much in its early stages. But I think it's perfectly clear that it will never, barring the military coup in Egypt, it won't return to the status quo ante, and to the extent that any government in Egypt is reflective of, representative of popular opinion, it's going to be at loggerheads with Israel. And in fact, after the Egyptian people, the second biggest beneficiary of the Egyptian revolt was in fact the people of Gaza. Because for the last year, Israel has periodically threatened to launch what it calls an Operation Cast-Lead 2 against the people of Gaza. But each time they make that threat, there are voices inside Israel that say, don't do it, because all hell will break loose in Egypt. They already attacked the Israeli consulate before, during the Arab Spring, and if they were to attempt another Operation Cast-Lead 2, many Israelis don't want to contemplate what will unfold in Egypt. And so Egypt now, in its minimal sense, is acting as a deterrent against further Israeli aggression in Gaza. If you look at the broader picture internationally, there's no question that Israel's stock has precipitously declined. Every year, the BBC World Service conducts a poll, and the poll asks a very simple question. It lists 36 countries, and it asks the question, do you think this country has a positive influence on world affairs or a negative influence on world affairs? And for the past 10 years, every year when they do the poll, it's as predictable as night following day. Every year, at the bottom of the list of the 36, there are 4 countries clustered which public opinion uniformly says exerts an overwhelmingly negative impact on the world. 3 of the countries will come as no surprise to anyone, so you'll always find at the bottom of the list North Korea. Not a big surprise. At the risk of embarrassing some people in the room, and I think they know it's coming, Pakistan always comes out at the bottom of the list. You can always tell Pakistanis in the audience from the nervous laugh. Look at the positive side. I'll get to that in a moment. The third country that always comes out at the bottom is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the fourth country, always grouped together with the other 3, it's always Israel. Well, that in itself is a remarkable fact for those people who remember the days, not so long ago, when Israel was held up as the light unto the nations, the democratic oasis in the Middle East, and all the rest. And now it's at the bottom. Quite a number of years, it's rock bottom. It is below North Korea. That's a fact. But what's more remarkable is the fact that if you take the other 3 countries, I think we can all agree that Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, they very rarely get what you might call favorable news coverage. So if I were to ask people in the room, is there anyone in this room who has ever seen a favorable article on North Korea anywhere except, of course, in the North Korea Daily? Is there anyone? No. And I think it's fair to say that the last time there was a favorable article about Pakistan was before India's partition. You get my point. And we don't have to dwell too long on Iran's coverage in the media. But Israel is different. Depending on the country in the world, the coverage is either overwhelmingly positive in places like the US, Canada, Australia, Germany. The coverage is overwhelmingly positive, or in places like the UK, where you could say sometimes favorable, sometimes unfavorable. Notwithstanding the huge gap separating the news coverage of the other 3 countries and Israel, nonetheless, the public sees now right through the misinformation, right through the disinformation, right through the misrepresentation and lies, and it groups Israel together with the other 3 countries. The most recent expression of this relatively recent phenomenon was when the Palestinians put forth their bid for statehood in the United Nations. The BBC did another World Service poll and asked a simple question: do you or do you not support Palestinian statehood? The result was quite remarkable. In every single country poll, every single country poll, either a plurality or a majority, said they supported Palestinian statehood. Now, when you consider that maybe 10 or 20 years ago, you were still trying to convince people that the Palestinians even existed as a people, and now it's reached the point that every single country polled, the public said to support Palestinian statehood. A huge distance has been traversed. When I say every single country, that's not an exaggeration. It includes the United States. When the poll was taken, there were two separate polls taken, one by the BBC and one by another very reputable polling service, Pew Charitable Trusts. And they both found that 45% of Americans supported Palestinian statehood, and depending on the poll, 25% or 35% opposed it. A plurality in the U.S. said yes to Palestinian statehood. But that doesn't even begin to attest to how new this reality is. Because, as everyone in this room knows, the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, he came out forcefully against the Palestinian bid for statehood. Both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, they both passed resolutions opposing the Palestinian bid for statehood. Both major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, they both came out with statements strongly opposing it. The entire major media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, they all had editorials opposing Palestinian statehood. But notwithstanding the unified and uniform opposition to Palestinian statehood by the whole gamut of the political elites in the United States, the American public still said in the plurality, nearly half, they said no. We support Palestinian statehood. It was a remarkable, you might even say, speaking for myself, it was a bewildering finding that they both managed to defy what their alleged leaders and opinion makers were telling them. And also, somehow, they managed to see through all the lies. It wasn't as if the Palestinian bid for statehood was a marginal issue. No, it was very much a focus of public attention. And the public, the people, they saw through it. They don't care what Barack Obama says. They don't care what the Republican Party, Democratic Party, Senate, House of Representatives, New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN. They don't care what any of them say. No, they said we support Palestinian statehood. Not only when I say there's been a significant shift in the U.S. that includes American Jews, where American Jews are now beginning, as the expression has it, to distance themselves from Israel. And they are distancing themselves from Israel for reasons which are perfectly obvious. American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. 80% of American Jews, they voted for Barack Obama in the 2008 election. with the exception of African Americans, there was no other ethnic group which voted in that percentage, even remotely in that percentage, for Barack Obama. Latinos, for example, they voted a percentage of about 63% for Obama. But American Jews, it was 80%. When you factor in that American Jews are now by a wide margin the richest ethno-religious group in the US, well, they should be voting Republican, because Republicans are the rich people's party. But no, American Jews, they vote Democratic in a much higher percentage than Latinos, even though Latinos are among the poorest ethnic groups. Still, Latinos vote Republican much more than Jews. Why? Because Jews are liberal. And liberal in the American context, it basically means belief in the rule of law, belief in equality under the law, belief in international institutions like the UN, belief in settling conflicts through diplomacy, not the resort to force. That's what being liberal means. And now American Jews are facing a crisis of conscience or shame because it's impossible any longer for people to call themselves liberal and defend the way Israel carries on. There was a time when Israel was able to project and control the projection of its image. And at that time, it was possible to call yourselves liberal and embrace Israel. But Israel is no longer able to thoroughly or completely control the image that's projected of it. And American Jews who are highly literate, they read the journals, the magazines, where the serious scholarship is presented. They know too much. They are too aware of the facts any longer to defend the way Israel carries on. Jews between the ages of, say, 50, we call it 55 and 70, an influential age cohort. Jews between the ages of 55 and 70, if you do the mathematics quickly in your head, you'll figure out that most of them grew up in the era of the 60s. You grow up in that era, and sort of the spirit of that era is, at any rate for American Jews, it's embodied in all we are saying. Anyone finish it? No, we do it all together now. For the young people and for ourselves and for our memory, all we are saying is peace of chance. At this point, we're supposed to start the slate. We'll leave the choreography out for now. So that's what you grew up with, and that's what you remember. And that's kind of part of the past that you want to preserve. It's a warm sentiment and memory. And then you have this country which says, all we are saying is give war a chance, and another chance, and another chance, and another chance. It's just very hard if you grew up in that era to reconcile the spirit of those times, a residue of which stays with you, with the way Israel carries on. Some of you know the American comedian Chris Rock. How many of you know him? Raise your hand. Yes. He's quite funny, or he was before he made it. Now he makes stupid movies about African-American hair. Chris, come on. In any case, some of you who know his videos will know he has this one on Michael Jackson. How many have seen it? Raise your hand. And you'll confirm for me, if time allowed, I would bring it up on the screen, because it's absolutely hilarious and much more worth watching than listening to me. He begins the video by going, or the routine, which is filmed, another kid! Another kid! Another kid! Everyone understand the reference? I don't know how to explain it. And whenever I listen to it, because it's very funny, we watch it several times, I can't help but think, Israel, another war, another war, another war. You said Saddam Hussein's Hitler and you cheerlead the war in Iraq. Credible estimates say, perhaps as many as 1 million Iraqis were killed. Before the bodies had gone cold, you go into Lebanon, you kill 1,200 people, 1,000 of them civilians. You decimate, you obliterate the whole infrastructure of Lebanon. They were trying to rebuild after a bitter and destructive civil war, a 15-year-long civil war. And just when they had reached the point of rebuilding their country and being able to take some pride in it, you send in your planes and you blow up every bridge in sight. And then before the bodies have a chance to go cold, you then go into Gaza, you kill 1,400 people, up to 1,200 of them civilians, 350 children, and then before those bodies have a chance to go cold, now you want to attack Iran. Another war! Another war! Now you have to destroy Iran because Saddam Hussein is no longer Hitler. Now Ahmadinejad is Hitler. And now it's no longer Iraq that's threatening the second Holocaust. Now it's Iran that's threatening the second Holocaust. Another war! It's very hard, if you're American, you're Jewish, you're liberal, to defend that. It's very hard. And it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, for younger Jews to defend that behavior, to defend the way Israel carries on. You're Jewish, you're young, you're idealistic, you're liberal, you're on a college campus. It's 2006. The last 72 hours of the war, a ceasefire resolution has finally been passed that witch from hell, Condoleezza Rice, who prevented it for 3 weeks, now it's finally passed, and they're just waiting to implement the resolution on the ground. The war is over. The resolution has been passed. They're just waiting to implement it. The war is over. The last 72 hours, Israel drops 4 million. That's 4, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 4 million cluster bomblets in South Lebanon. The war is already over. If you read the accounts, for example, Human Rights Watch's flooding South Lebanon, entire villages are saturated with these cluster bomblets. It's like a science fiction movie when you read what happened. You're young, you're Jewish, you're idealistic, you're liberal, you attend Imperial College. You don't want to defend that in public. No, you don't. It's 2008-9. Israel attacks Gaza, and it makes, as it always does, promiscuous use of the white phosphorus. White phosphorus, it reaches a temperature of 800 degrees centigrade, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As Oprah would say, try wrapping your mind around that one. And what does Israel do with the white phosphorus? It drops it on the school, on the humanitarian aid warehouse. It drops it into hospitals. It drops the white phosphorus on Al Quds Hospital and on Al Wafa Hospital. You're young, you're Jewish, you're idealistic, you're liberal. That's really 90% of American Jews. 10% are Orthodox and quite conservative. But 90% young, Jewish, liberal, idealistic. You don't want to defend that in public. Now, there are people who will defend it. No question about that. Every Republican nominee for president will defend it. Well, there are people who will defend breaking the kneecaps of nuns. Every Republican nominee for president would do that. But it's not a Jewish thing. Say what you want, Jews don't defend that sort of thing. They don't. I'm not saying they don't do it. I'm not referring out to the nuns. But they don't defend that sort of thing in public. Or they do with a very big adult and a guilty face. So, this is all a long way of saying, or a relatively short way actually, of saying that there is now a broad public that's ready to listen. That's something new. There's a broad public which, number one, is aware that there's a serious problem in that corner of the world. Well, that's not new. Israel-Palestine has been on the front pages for a very long time. But what is new is that now, for the first time in historic recollection, a broad public recognizes that Israel bears a significant burden of responsibility for what's going wrong, horribly wrong, in that part of the world. That is new. which means, as a political fact, it means there's a broad public that's ready to listen. However, unless you present them, the public, unless you present them with a solution to the conflict, unless you present them with a unified and uniform solution to the conflict, they'll get frustrated, they'll get exasperated, and they'll just move on. They'll throw their hands up in despair and say, these people never agreed on anything, and they'll turn their attention elsewhere. If that gentleman all the way to my right, if he says, we should support a two-state settlement, but the woman next to him says, no, we should support one state. But then the gentleman next to her says, no, we should support a binational state. But then the fellow next to him says, no, we should support a federal state. But then the woman next to him says, no, we should support a secular democratic state. But then the fellow next to him says, no, they're all wrong. We should support an Islamic state. Well, amidst this cacophony of solutions, the public is just going to yawn. It'll think, hey, not even these people know how to solve the conflict. How am I supposed to know? And they'll move on. And then, if we're going to be honest, I think we have then committed a historical crime. We've squandered an opportunity to reach the public and finally create a movement which will exert enough pressure to end the conflict. And so our chief responsibility at this particular moment, I'll resist the inflated language at this historical conjuncture, because I'm not writing for New Left Review. I'll just say, at this historic moment, the main responsibility is to present a unified and uniform message to the public how to solve the conflict. Well, what is the solution to present? That's the next obvious and logical question, correct? I know he's a physicist. Would you agree that's the next logical question? As long as I have the agreement of the physicist, I know I'm on the right track. And I myself pondered for a long time amidst this cacophony of solutions, what's the right way to go? What should we present to the public? And I decided I wanted to see what the Mahatma, Mr. Gandhi, had to say about the subject. First of all, because India, like the Palestinians, they both were trying to end an occupation. In the case of India, the British occupation. Number two, both India under Mr. Gandhi's time, and Mr. Gandhi's time, and Palestinians, they both have to ultimately face the world's most formidable political and economic power. In Gandhi's time, the UK, and in our time, the United States. And thirdly, I will simply assert it. I won't try to argue it at this moment. I do not believe the Palestinians have a violent option, the option of armed resistance. It is not a viable or tenable option in Palestine, and therefore, by default, they have to adopt a strategy in some ways analogous to the strategy Mr. Gandhi resorted to in India, some form of nonviolent disobedience and civil resistance. So, I decided to look at Mr. Gandhi mostly because he did have success in mobilizing large numbers of people. However much credit you give him for ending the British occupation, and people can disagree about that, there's no doubt that he did something novel in India, which was to reach masses of ordinary people and get them to act. So, I started to read through Mr. Gandhi's collected works, which will come as a surprise to some of you, probably all of you. Mr. Gandhi's collected works, they run to 98 500-page volumes. Mr. Gandhi had a lot to say about a lot of things. In fact, by his own admission, he had many deeply held convictions about topics which he knew not a word about. But that never stopped Mr. Gandhi from expressing his deep conviction after confessing, I haven't a clue what I'm talking about. That was one of his arrogant side. It was not his appealing side, I don't think. And in fact, most of Gandhi's collected works don't have anything to do with politics in the narrow sense. It's mostly about good diet and good health. He was a kind of a premature Oprah. If you read his prison letters, his typical prison letters read, August 1st, I weigh 90.4 pounds. August 2nd, I weigh 90.2 pounds. August 3rd, I weigh 89.9 pounds. And I'm thinking, you know, Mahatma, I really don't care. And I can't imagine who does. But as you can see, in many ways, he's similar to Oprah, though it's a problem of a different magnitude. I think I said that in a very politically correct way. And also, Gandhi was into natural cures. He had a natural cure for everything. If you suffer from constipation, indigestion, impotence, he had a natural cure for you, a carrot, celery, something. Goat's milk is very good. I did recommend some of these cures to some of my friends who suffered from some of those maladies, but so far, no success. At any rate, I'm aware of. But of course, Gandhi had a lot to say about politics as well. And one of the most important things I think Gandhi had to say about politics, he said that politics is not about trying to change public opinion. It is not about trying to change public opinion. Politics is about trying to get people to act on what they already know is wrong. That's what politics is about. And for me, that was a kind of revelation when I started to read it, because I come from a political tradition, as I suspect some of the older people in this room do, where I thought that me and my friends, we called each other comrades, that we possessed the truth we had in our possession the truth. And in fact, we were so certain of our truth that we said our truth was scientific. It was a scientific truth, as scientific as the laws of physics, even though most of us who said it did not fare very well in our science courses, so that was recited. And our job was to take our truth, to go among the masses, and to enlighten them, to dispel their false consciousness, to bring lightness where there was darkness, to bring illumination to the benighted masses. That's how we saw politics. But Gandhi said, no, that's not politics. Politics is you get people to act on what they already know is wrong. They don't need you to tell you it's wrong. They know that. The problem is they don't do anything about it. And we all have that experience. I'm certain there's not a person in this room who doesn't carry on each day like myself. You get up in the morning, and for the moment you step out of your house, you look around you, you see something, you say, that's wrong. That's unfair. That's unjust. That shouldn't be. That's uncivilized. Why is that going on in our society? And you go through the day, you're venting, you're indignant at all of these unjust situations, all of these injustices, but you don't do anything about it. I rail against it day in and day out, week in and week out, month in, year in, and so forth. But I never get past the stage of indignation. But then this past year, I live in New York City, and I begin to hear these people who are upset about how our society's wealth is distributed, and they even are sitting in at Wall Street. So I thought to myself, you know, that's good. Really, does that have much to do with me? I'm not sure. I'm older. These are kids. But then, one day I read in the news, 800 of them got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. I live in Brooklyn. I thought to myself, now wait a minute. They're always complaining about this inevitable distribution of wealth. And there are these 800 people who got arrested, and they're chanting, we are the 99%. And they don't like the fact that 1% are taking everything to themselves. And I said, well, you know what? I think it's time for me to do something. And I became involved in it, as did quite a large number of New Yorkers. And then some other people were engaging in nonviolent resistance, and the police came over with a pepper spray and sprayed it and just went along like this line here, as they were sitting, and just sprayed it in their eyes. And that galvanized a lot of people. Nobody had to tell, enlighten the American people that there's something really screwed up with this system. They're telling us we're in this recession, nearly the depression, and each day you read in the paper, these bankers are giving themselves $25 million bonuses. You didn't need anybody to enlighten the people. What you needed to do was to get them to act on their indignation and knowledge. And that's what Gandhi said politics is all about. But there's one hitch, one qualification. And the qualification is, no matter how moral and just the methods you use are, as in nonviolent civil disobedience, unless the public agrees with your goal, you're never going to get the public to act. So what does that mean in practice? Let's take in the case of the US, the abortion issue. All the public opinion polls show that American people, they're divided right down the middle on the question of abortion. 50% say they're pro-choice, 50% say they're pro-life. So let's take a little mind experiment. Imagine the 50% who call themselves pro-life. They say we're going to descend on all the abortion clinics in the United States, and we're going to go collectively, en masse, on a fast unto the death, until and unless the physicians stop performing abortions. Well, nobody in this room can take exception to the means. What could be more moral than the willingness to give up your own life for a cause without inflicting any bodily harm on anyone else? However, if they went on the fast unto the death, will it really persuade the pro-choice people? Most pro-choice people, they heard that the pro-life people en masse were going on a fast unto the death. They would say, I hope they do go on a fast unto the death, and I hope they all drop dead. Which is another way of saying that you have to reach the public not only through your methods, you have to get their agreement, their sanction, not only to your methods, but also to your goals. If you promote the wrong goal, you're going to lose the public. And instead of creating or building a movement, you end up creating a cult. And there's a very big difference, a world of difference, between a movement and a cult. Mr. Gandhi, he actually led two lives simultaneously. He was a leader of the Indian independence movement, but he also was the leader of an ashram. And an ashram is like a cult. And Gandhi was a very strict ashram leader. You want to be in my ashram, he said? Well, you can't eat meat because we're vegetarians. You can't have sex even if you're married because we're brahmacharis. No idle jokes, no reading books or newspapers in the toilet, no wearing wristwatches, no underwear. Yes, Gandhi had a very strict, and some might call it eccentric, set of rules. It's hard to laugh at Gandhi because he was so deeply serious about his convictions. Those were his deeply held beliefs. But Gandhi was a shrewd enough political leader to understand that if you want to build an independence movement, you don't use the same standards of entry as you do in a cult or in a ashram. If he said to be a member of the Congress Party, you're not allowed to wear underwear, well, there are 450 million Indians. The whole Congress Party probably couldn't fill this room. you have to be clear that if you're trying to build a political movement, there's an altogether different standard than if you're trying, or if you are a member of a cult. So what does that mean for us? It means two things, in my opinion. Number one, politics is not about what you think, you think, you think, you think, you think, or I think. That's not what politics is about. Politics is about what can reach a broad public. Some of you are maybe wondering, why am I mentioning that? Because there's this strange phenomenon when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, or I should say by the Palestine solidarity component. Inside of every conversation, within 30 seconds, the question comes up, do you support one state or two states? It's a kind of litmus test. Do you support one state or two states? As if politics were a Chinese menu. One from column A, two from column B. That question, if you're a political person, is completely irrelevant. The only relevant question is, what is the public prepared to support? What can you win a broad public to? Number two, politics is not about your personal morality. It's not about your personal morality. It's not about your personal morality, or my personal morality. It is not. Politics is about the public's sense of right and wrong, the public's sense of morality. You can have the better moral argument, and I still say it's politically irrelevant. So, let's imagine this first row of people. They live in my neighborhood in Ocean Parkway, and they go out one day and they say, we're going to block all the traffic at Ocean Parkway. We're going to carry on nonviolent civil disobedience because we want to shake the conscience of the public. It's winter. The temperatures are frigid outside. There are all these homeless people who are there through no fault of their own. Many of them are Mexican workers who came to the United States working jobs which no American will take at wages that no American will take, but they can't afford the rents. So these people, I think we're going to have to engage in some non-violent civil
My wife, I'll talk to when I get home. I should turn it off.
Actually, usually at these moments, I would choose to zap you with a phaser.
Please.
Non-violent. Well, these people go on Ocean Parkway, they block traffic, and they say, everybody in this room knows you have a spare winter coat that you never use. In fact, I dare say, everyone in this room, bar none, has at least 2 or 3 spare winter coats in their room that they never use. They just sit in a closet collecting dust. And the nonviolent civil disobedience resistors, they say, we want to quicken your conscience. Give the winter coat talk to these people, they're freezing, you don't need the coat. I think most people would say, you know what, I think they got a point. And a lot of people, myself included, would go to the closet, take out the winter coats, and very proudly go downstairs and give it to the homeless. I have no doubt about that. However, let us say these same people, they blocked traffic, the same point, frigid temperatures, homeless people freezing, but they say, not they want your spare winter coat, they want your spare room in your house or apartment. Now, I personally have wrestled with that question a lot. And I have to admit, morally, they have the better argument. If you use the proverbial standard, what would Jesus do? I think he'd give the room. In fact, I'm sure he'd give the room. But there's another admission I have to make. I'm not ready to do it. I will admit, you have the better argument. Morally, I cannot answer it, but I'm not ready to do it. And I don't think the broad public would be ready to do it. If that's what they demanded, I think most people in the public would say, no, those people are crazy, they ought to get arrested. You lose them. Politics is not about personal senses of morality or right and wrong. Because you can be morally right, but politically ineffective or politically irrelevant. And so now the challenge for us is, what solution to the conflict is likely to win over a broad public? Not what solution is the most moral, based on any of yours or my own moral standards, but I think the only relevant question is, what solution is most likely to win over a broad public? Assuming that our idea of politics is not to hatch a conspiracy of coup d'etat and grab the levers of power, but our idea of politics is to reach masses of people and build a real popular movement. I start from that place. That's what I think politics is about. So, I would say that in fact, it doesn't require the talents of a particle physicist to figure out what the solution is. Because if you look at the most representative political bodies in the world today, or the most respected legal bodies in the world today, or the most respected human rights organizations in the world today, whichever angle or vantage point you want to examine the question, you get the same conclusion. Namely, however you look at it, the only possible solution that has any possibility of reaching a broad public is the two-state settlement on the June 67 border with a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. Now, that is not my formulation. It's neither my personal morality nor my personal political preference, which, as I said, I consider completely irrelevant. So I would ask this gentleman here, what is the most representative political organization in the world today? Yes, the United Nations General Assembly. And every year, the UN General Assembly, it passes a resolution entitled Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. And every year, they put forth the same terms for resolving the conflict. A two-state settlement based on a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, and a just resolution of the refugee question based on the right of return and compensation. And every year, the vote is the same. The whole world on one side, Israel, the US, and some South Sea islands on the other side. That's not meant to be humorous. That's meant to accurately reflect the reality. 1997, the vote, 155 to 2. The whole world on one side, Israel and the United States on the other side. 2004, the vote, 161 to 7. The whole world on one side, Israel, the US, Australia, Grenada, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau on the other side. 2010, the vote, 165 to 7. Israel, the US, Australia, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau on the other side. And this past year, the vote was 167 to 7. The same picture. The whole world agrees. This is the way to resolve the problem. Now, there are 2 points to make. One, a footnote, and an amusing footnote. In fact, the picture is even more lopsided than that, because Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau, they are American protectorates. The U.S., in effect, owns them. They have what's called a compact of free association, where the U.S. has the right to control all of their external and internal policy. In fact, according to the compact of free association, the U.S. has the right to blow them up. Yes, because it has the right to do whatever it needs for military purposes. So if it decides it needs to test a nuke, it has the right to eliminate Palau. Which is also a slightly decided point, because as a result of global warming, Palau is disappearing anyhow. As is Tuvalu, which also used to be an American ally, but Tuvalu got angry at the way the U.S. was voting against Kyoto because they were going underwater because of the global warming, so they changed their position. The second point is when I say the whole world, that includes, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you look at the voting record, since 2003, the Islamic Republic of Iran has voted with the rest of the world. In the real world, there are only 2 obstacles to resolving the conflict: the U.S. and Israel, or Israel backed by the United States. Now, some people might object to what I said, and they say, but, you know, the UN, it doesn't reflect people, it reflects governments, it reflects states, and they aren't really representative of the people. Okay, I'll grant there's an argument there. Here, it's fine, don't worry, I'll manage. I'll grant there's an argument there. So instead of looking at the most representative organization in the world today, what would anyone want to venture a opinion? What is the most respected legal body in the world today? Anyone want to shout it out?
ICJ?
Yes, I say, both of you, ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Right. Well, no, the ICJ, the U.S. does recognize it, being the International Criminal Court, which is a separate body. The ICJ is the most respected legal body in the world today. And as it happens, in 2004, it rendered an advisory opinion on many of the relevant issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So number one, it said, under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in the course of the 1967 war. So the ICJ said Israel has no title to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These are occupied Palestinian territories. The nomenclature is the ICJ's occupied Palestinian territories. Number two, the International Court of Justice said, under international law, it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory, and therefore all of the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal under international law. All 500,000 settlers are illegally situated in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, the vote in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it wasn't one justice who said that. It wasn't a minority of justices who said that. It wasn't a majority, or I should say a plurality of justices who said that. And it wasn't even a majority of justices who said that. It was all 15 judges who said that. There was no disagreement, no dispute, no controversy on those particular questions. Some of you are familiar with the lingo, the lexicon, the jargon of what's called the peace process. And so you'll know that there's this thing called the final status issues, the permanent status issues. Anyone want to venture to name one of the four? Say it out loud. Name one of the four. Everyone knows it. East Jerusalem is one. Refugees is two. Settlements is three. And borders is four. Correct. Those are the four final status issues. And on three of the four, the ICJ rendered an opinion. They didn't render an opinion of the refugee question because it did not come up in the particular case that they were adjudicating. But the leading human rights organizations in the world, they have taken a position on the refugee question. So if I were to ask you to name what are the leading human rights organizations in the world, they would be Amnesty International, and what's the second? What? And Human Rights Watch. Yes, uncontroversial. But those are the two leading human rights organizations. And as it happens in 2000 and 2001, the human rights organizations, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they both issued opinion papers, position papers, on the refugee question. Human Rights Watch said, we urge Israel to recognize the right to return for those Palestinians and their descendants who fled from territory that is now within the state of Israel and who have maintained appropriate links with that territory. Amnesty International said, we call for Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza, along with those of their descendants who have maintained genuine links with the area, to be able to exercise their right of return. Well, that points to three critical conclusions. Number one, we're always told that what are called the permanent status issues, the final status issues, settlements, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, we're always told these are very complex questions. They are controversial. They are intricate. They require the knowledge, the equivalent of rocket science, to penetrate their mysteries. But in fact, in the real world, there is no controversy whatsoever, literally none, on these questions. So, if you open up your typical periodical, they'll say the settlements are controversial. Israel's settlements are controversial. Oh no, they're not. All 15 judges in the highest judicial body in the world said, all 15, two of whom incidentally are Jewish. Rosalind Higgins was married to an Irishman. She's the British representative on the ICJ. And Thomas Bergenthal, the American representative, was also a Holocaust survivor. All 15 judges, including Justice Higgins and Bergenthal, they all 15 said the settlements are illegal under international law. Full stop. The UN Security Council said the settlements are a flagrant violation of international law. Full stop. We're told the territories, the West Bank, these are disputed territories. Disputed territories. How many people have seen that description of them? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, each time you see that, you should write a letter and say, but wait, there's no dispute whatsoever. All 15 judges on the International Court of Justice said these are occupied Palestinian territories. Full stop. Israel says East Jerusalem is part of its undivided, eternal, and indivisible capital. Okay, that's what Israel says. But the International Court of Justice says East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territories. And they're very clear in denoting that fact. They refer to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and the Gaza Strip as occupied Palestinian territory. There's no dispute. And the same goes for the refugee question. The most authoritative human rights organizations in the world have said the Palestinian refugees have the right of return and compensation, period. So that's conclusion number one. Conclusion number two, on all of the final status issues, settlements, borders, Jerusalem, and refugees, Israel's position, its official position, has been rejected and repudiated by the whole of the international community. To put it simply, legally, Israel doesn't have a leg to stand on. It has no support in the international community for the positions it's held in its negotiations with the Palestinians. And the Israelis are perfectly aware of that fact. They're not oblivious to it. So, for example, in 2008, during the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis were represented by their foreign minister, Tzipi Livni. At one point, Tzipi Livni said, and now I'm quoting her, she said, "I am a lawyer, but I am against law, international law in particular." Now, in fact, Tzipi Livni was being perfectly consistent because she's Israel's foreign minister. And she is a lawyer, and she knows perfectly well that under the law, Israel has no case. So she cannot represent Israel's positions as a foreign minister and still support the law. If she wants to be foreign minister, she's very consistent. If she wants to be foreign minister, she has to be against the law. You can't square that circle because Israel's positions have been completely repudiated by the whole of the international community. Those are the first two conclusions. But there is a third conclusion which is as significant as the other two. The third conclusion is that Israel is a state. It has the same rights and responsibilities, the same rights and obligations as any other state. That's the law. When the International Court of Justice said the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories, in the same breath and simultaneously, it delineated the legal borders of Israel. And it said the borders from before the June 1967 war are Israel's borders. Israel is a state. These are its legal borders. Now, it's the nature of law that you can't pick and choose. You can't say, I have the right to walk at the green, but I'm agnostic on the red. I'm not sure what I think. Well, some people, of course, would like to knock the bulb out of the red, but we'll leave aside that, and we'll just stick to the agnostics. You can't have a right to walk at the green unless you accept your obligation and responsibility to stop at the red. The law is a package deal. Rights come with responsibility. Rights come with obligations. That's the law. You cannot win a broad public if you selectively choose from the law, because the broad public will see right through it. It's called hypocrisy. You only choose the laws that you like, because you have to remember, the moment you step outside your own little world, you're now in the broad public. And when you're in the broad public, you have to contend with what the other side says. you don't have a monopoly over what the public hears. And so the other side says, okay, they claim that they just want to enforce the law. But that's not true, because they don't accept the law that says Israel is a state. And the broad public, in my opinion, rightly concludes that you're being hypocritical. Either you accept the law as a whole, as a total package, or else you have to be honest enough to say, you're not really looking for enforcement of the law. You're only looking for enforcement of the laws which you find appealing. And that's not the rule of law. The rule of law is rights and responsibility, rights and obligations. That's the law. Now, this has nothing whatsoever to do with personal opinions. It's about how do you win a broad public. And you cannot win a broad public through duplicity, disingenuousness, or double standards. It will never work. And so you have two options. Either you take the law as a package, or you can always say, I don't accept the law. That's fair enough. But then you have to ask yourself the next logical question. If you're not going to use the law as a weapon or as leverage to reach the public, what are you going to use? What is going to be your standard? My morality? My sense of right and wrong? Why should the public choose your morality over anybody else's? Why would they? One thing you can say, I think, as a fair generalization, the public understands the notion, enforce the law. If you put forth as your program, your solution, your goals, if you're asked, how do you want to solve the conflict? I know there's a lot of trouble there. I know Israel bears a lot of responsibility. How do you want to resolve the conflict? I think an answer that is almost certain to evoke a favorable response, all you have to say is, I just want to enforce the law. That's all I want, to enforce the law. But you have to bear in mind the law not as you would wish it to be, but the law as it is. And I, at any rate, cannot think of an alternative proposal that's likely to reach a broad public. Now, maybe other people have other ideas, and we can discuss that presently. Let me now just look at the two major objections to what I've just had to say. I'll start with the Israeli side. The Israelis, their current position is that we've all been suffering from a misapprehension, they say. The problem is not settlements, it's not Jerusalem, it's not borders, it's not the right of return. No, that's not the problem. The problem, says Mr. Netanyahu, he says the Palestinians have to recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own in this land. They have to finally do what they have refused to do for 62 years. They have to say yes to a Jewish state. They have to say, I will accept the Jewish state. Those 6 words will change history. That's the current position, that we've all been suffering from a misapprehension. The problem is not what we call the final status issues. The problem is accepting Israel as a Jewish state. Well, how credible is that argument? And here I think we have a reasonable way of checking how credible it is. Because if Israel were to sign a peace treaty with the Palestinians, it would be their third peace treaty with an Arab state. They have peace treaties with Egypt, signed in 1979, and a peace treaty with Jordan, signed in 1994. And if you read the treaties, Egypt never recognized Israel as a Jewish state. Jordan never recognized Israel as a Jewish state. In fact, we have a pretty clear record of the negotiations between Egypt and Israel in 1977 through 79. I can tell you, from having read the record quite closely, the issue never even came up. Israel never even requested that Egypt recognize it as a Jewish state. Why did they pull this new rabbit out of the hat? And the answer is perfectly obvious. As every lawyer will tell you, if your case is indefensible, change the subject. And so the Israelis know that they have no case any longer on the basis of international law to the settlements, to Jerusalem, to any part of the West Bank, or to block the right of return. So this new Netanyahu does what any good lawyer would do. He changes the subject. I won't go through that further. I have more to say, but I want to turn, lastly, because I know it's gone on at some length, I want to turn to the practical objection that's often raised by Israel supporters. In fact, just a few moments ago, I was doing an interview with a very recent fellow, Frank Barak. Is he here? Or he? Okay, he had to take off early. And Frank raised the same objection as almost everybody typically does. He said, look, even if everything you said were true, it's completely irrelevant, because Israel has now built these settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. The settlements have shredded the social and economic fabric of the Palestinian territories. They preclude, they preempt any possibility of a Palestinian state, and that whatever you might say, de facto, there's now one state. These settlements are scattered all over the West Bank. De facto, there's one state. So how many people are familiar with that argument and even subscribe to it? So raise your hand up high. Raise your hand up high. Okay. Now, first of all, we need to clarify the facts, because this is not a theoretical question, it's a factual one. And I suspect many of you in this room will be surprised to learn that the settlements, what are called the built-up areas, they actually only comprise 1% of the West Bank. That's correct. They only comprise 1% of the West Bank. Now, some of you are giving me that perplexed, stunned look. How can that be? And the reason is as follows. We'll have this gentleman here. Can you raise your hand up high? Or maybe just stand up, because it makes it easier. We'll call him Settlement A. And this gentleman here, can you stand up? And we'll call him Settlement B. And one of you in the back row, can you just stand up? Whoever feels like being a settlement, okay. Settlement C. Well, you'll all agree, I think, that Settlement A, Settlement B, and Settlement C, they constitute about 1% of the room. The problem is, Israel says, it doesn't want just the settlements, it wants the settlement blocks. And a settlement block means you connect settlement A to settlement B, connect A and B to C, and then obviously it comes out to a significant portion of the room. And so, for the past 10 years in the negotiations, the Israelis basically say that we want to keep roughly 10% of the West Bank because we want to keep these settlement blocks, which are outlined on their map. So the blocks in the north, they're Ariel and Shamron. They're called the two fingers. And then the block in the middle is Ma'ale Adumim, which stretches almost to Jericho now. And the Palestinian negotiators, they said, look, we want to settle the conflict. We want to find a solution. But there is no way you can keep the settlement blocks. Not because we're being stubborn, not because we're being inflexible, but because if you keep the settlement blocks, there is no Palestinian state. These two blocks in the north, Ariel and Shamron, you can't tell from the topography, but because of the topography, they basically bisect the northern sector of the West Bank. And beneath them, all the way to the border, are the critical Palestinian water resources. You keep the blocks, you deprive the Palestinians of the water. You go down to the middle of this settlement called Ma'ale Adumim. It also bisects the West Bank at the center, and as important, it separates East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Now, as any Palestinian will tell you, no East Jerusalem, no Palestinian state. That's not rhetorical, and it's not symbolic. It's simply a fact. Because the area that's called Metropolitan Jerusalem, it stretches from Jerusalem to Ramallah in the north and Bethlehem in the south. That little area, it accounts for 30 to 40% of the Palestinian economy. No East Jerusalem, no state. That's just a fact. So, at this point, it looks pretty grim. There are those who say, and those who raise their hands and say, it's a done deal, no two states. It sounds credible. However, the Palestinians then said, we're going to present you with an alternative map. And here's the map that we're going to present. If you look in the areas along the border, the little areas outlined in black, they blue inside, outlined in black, they constitute 1.9% of the West Bank. They are 1.9% of the West Bank. Does the pointer work? I'm not sure. Yeah, so that little area, and then these little areas here, 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 and over here. And the Palestinians said, we'll let you keep that 1.9% if we can have a land swap of equal value land, equal size land, which are the areas they mark off in yellow over here. So 1.9% for 1.9%. Now many of you perhaps are thinking rightfully, how does that really solve anything? But here's where the facts are important. That 1.9% contains more than 300,000 of the settlers. It contains 63% of the settlers. And so the Palestinians said, the settlers are illegal, that's the law, under the law, you should be, all 500,000 should be evicted. But they said, we'll try to be reasonable. We're going to let you keep more than 300,000 of your settlers in place, have a land swap, and also, as you can judge for yourself, the map of the West Bank is clean. There are no protruding saliences which render a Palestinian state fragmented. It's a clean map. And a solution is possible. It's very striking when you read the internal record, as I have, it came out in the Palestine papers. When they presented the map in 2008 to Sydney Lively, she really didn't have an answer. You could see she recognized it was actually a reasonable proposal. But she said at some point, she said, politically, no Israeli prime minister can present it and still retain power. The problem was not physical. The problem was political. And I think that's where we come in. We have to change the calculus of power such that the Israeli prime minister is forced to accept that map and forced to withdraw. Now, some people doing the math, they say to themselves, well, wait a minute. 500,000 settlers minus 300,000, that still leaves 200,000. What do we do with them? In fact, that's not nearly the problem it's made out to be either. Because the Israeli settlers overwhelmingly, they went to live in the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, because of subsidized mortgages, subsidized health care, subsidized education. There was called quality of life settlers. They didn't go for ideological reasons, they weren't ideological fanatics. Overwhelmingly, they say, if Israel compensates them financially, they'll move back. And in fact, only a handful, maybe 5,000, maybe 10,000, a handful are what you would call ideological zealots, whom it's tough to get to move, or it appears tough. Is it really tough? No. Because as Israel's former head of the secret police, the Shin Bet, a fellow named Abraham Shalom, he was asked, what about these ideological zealots, these zealots? What do we do with them? And he replied, I don't believe that they are all that brave. When we leave them out there alone, they'll come, and how fast they'll come back. It's not so complicated. Some of you have been to Hebron, Al Khalil. You've been there, raise your hand. Oh my gosh. You have some sort of relationship with them? Drugs or something? Raise your hand again. That's highly improbable. Is there like a tavern here called Hebron? I'm talking about the West Bank city. How is that? Something's going on there. I'm going to have to alert M5. In any case, I think the people here will attest. I lived in Hebron for a long time and also in Al-Fawar camp outside Hebron. Hebron is a very traditional city. It's the most traditional religious Muslim city in the West Bank. Hebronites are traditional, religious, they're very stubborn. Everyone knows the Hebronites, everybody knows the joke. Did you hear about the Hebronite who fell off a 6-story building and he lived? He lived? Really? How? He landed on his head. Very big stone, the Hebronites. And then you have in the heart of the old city, you have 400 crazy Jews, the sugar Jews. Most of them from my own neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. Speaking as a Brooklynite, good riddance, but of course they shouldn't have landed there. They should have landed where they belong, on Mars. In any case, now you have these 400 crazy Jews. And the women that have that look in their eyes like the Stepford Wives, for those of you who know the movie, the men invasion of the body snatchers, crazy people. But then they say they're not moving. This land is mine, God gave this land to me. You know, they saw Exodus, they think it's theirs, they're not going. Okay? All you have to do is you go to those 400 crazy Jews, and all you have to say is, hey guys, you want to stay? Stay. But we, the army, we're leaving. You want to stay with 160,000 Hebronites surrounding you? You laugh, but that's in fact the truth. All of these claims are just not credible on a moment's reflection. The conflict can find its resolution. It is possible. And that's the first thing we have to take to heart. It doesn't have to go on and on and on and on. I have been involved in this conflict my entire adult life. 3 decades. It's a very sobering fact. My entire life has passed before my eyes on this tiny pinprick in the world's map. You take the total population of Israel, the Palestinians, throw in the refugees, you still don't get one housing project in Shanghai. The buildings are very tall. And you know, sometimes I really have to ask myself, did I make a wise decision? Reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages on human rights reports about incidents that nobody remembers, nobody even knew happened anymore, completely forgotten, including by me. Every once in a while I do the house cleaning, I go to the human rights reports and take out a stack like this, and I bring it over to my incinerator. It's like I'm throwing away now 3 years of my life. It's a very strange feeling. And you know, knowledge has great depth and breadth, and there are so many things that I would like to have read. And it didn't happen. And like I said, sometimes I do despair of what I did. But now I have to think there's every reason to be hopeful. People are ready to listen. And now we have to reach them and get them to act. And I think if we get them to act, we can actually achieve a settlement of the conflict. Our challenge now is very simple. I think I know what I'm talking about because I'm speaking now from experience, not from theory. Our challenge now is very simple. We have to show the broad public we are the reasonable ones. They are unreasonable. We are reasonable. We just want to enforce the law. We want to enforce the law as everyone recognizes that law to be, with no exceptions. The other side does not have an answer. They do not. They are stuck. That's why Livni says she's against the law, and that's why Mr. Netanyahu wants to change the subject, because they don't have an answer. I do not believe a single member of the British public, with the possible exception of Tony Blair, I don't think a single member of the British public, if presented with this map and its background, could possibly call it unfair. If you say to them, every single settler is illegally there under international law, but the Palestinians said we'll let 63% stay. I don't think anyone can call that unfair. We have a very strong case. In fact, I think we have an impregnable case. I don't think we can lose. If we meet the public where it is, if we overreach them with a different solution, I think we lose them. Edward Said, most of you know him by name for sure, and some of you have the good fortune to hear him or meet him. At the end of his life, he liked to quote the Caribbean poet Henley College, the line, "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. It took me a little while to appreciate that line, but then I finally got it. Because most of us, when we think of victory, we think of victors and vanquished, winners and losers. But then the line says, there's room for everyone. No winners, no losers. No victors, no vanquished. There's room for everyone. Just be fair. Just be reasonable. Nobody is saying the Palestinians should have to give up any of their rights. Those are their rights. And just as none of us, myself included, would want to be lectured that for the purposes of peace, we have to give up one or two of our rights, none of us would like to be lectured in that fashion. And nobody has the right to tell Palestinians that they have to forfeit any of their rights for the sake of peace. That's being principled. And those rights are not abstract and they're not generic. We know exactly what those rights are because they've been laid out year after year in UN resolutions. They've been depicted in human rights reports and the International Court of Justice. But we also want to be reasonable. We want to show everyone, including the other side, if and when they come to their senses, that there's a way out that preserves everybody's dignity intact, everybody's rights intact, and protects everybody's chance at life's happiness. Now, some of you might reasonably ask, what does reasonable and principled look like in practice? And I would say the map. It's principled. Palestinians get 100%, that's their territory, and not an inch less. But it's also reasonable. It's a reasonable way to solve the problem. I think if we're reasonable and principled, fair and decent, we can all, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Palestinian, Israeli, we could all find our place at that rendezvous of victory. And that's not for me a cliche. That's a fact. It's a living reality. Now, speaking finally, selfishly, I want to get to that rendezvous of victory. I am determined that I am going to get there. I don't know if I'm going to be jogging, very unlikely. My legs have gone. There's a geriatrics brigade on the boardwalk where I live, and they're going along at a faster pace than me when I'm jogging at full speed. It's a very pitiful sight. Maybe I'll be walking, maybe I'll have a cane, maybe it's a wheelchair, maybe it's a stretcher with life supports. But I'm getting to that rendezvous of victory. There's one hitch. I cannot get there alone. That map is still a real battle to get it. The Israelis are very stubborn and very arrogant. To get those basic Palestinian rights is still a real battle. And we're only going to get there if we do it together. It's got to be me, but it's got to be all of you. But I said, I'm going to get there. Now, if you follow the logic of my argument, as the particle physicist has already processed in his mind, you know that I'm going to be seeing all of you at that rendezvous of victory, and I cannot wait. Thank you.
So we take two questions only, one from this side, one from this side. The microphone is here. Two questions, okay. Yes, please,
I'd be really interested in an answer to the question, what would it take America to withdraw its support from Israel?
Good question.
It is a tough battle, but I don't believe it's a hopeless battle. Whether you can get a commanding American movement that will completely support a just settlement, no. But whether you can put limits on the outrages committed by the U.S. government in support of Israel, I think it's a possibility. If you look at the poll data, some of which I sampled to you, the BBC poll on the U.S., Americans for the first time in memory, when they were asked if Israel exerts a positive or negative impact on the world, I think you'll be very surprised to learn it was divided down the middle. 48% said positive, 48% said negative. Americans are now split on the question of Israel. If you look at the reactions to, say, the Israeli assault on Wadi Marmara, on the attack on Gaza, it did not get much American support. I think the challenge now is we have to get our act together. And if we do, I think we have, I don't think we can reverse U.S. policy, but I think we can put limits on it. Because people are grown tired of this country. So I don't want to be unduly optimistic, but I don't want to be unduly pessimistic either. A very good friend of mine who knows the Washington scene, he says one of the reasons AIPAC, the Israel lobby, is so successful in Washington is because they've never really had an opposition. There's no efficient, effective organization actually challenging AIPAC. It's on a completely free field. Now, how much we can succeed if we do our work correctly, I don't think we know. You know, as my friend said, you don't know how many of these Congress people are bought off, and how many of them are just genuinely ignorant. They get all this information from AIPAC, and they never get anything from the other side. Or what they get from the other side is so poorly written and so poorly argued and so full of slogans that it has no impact. So I want to, reserve judgment on how much we can change until we have a good, solid organization in place. But as I said earlier, it's not sufficient to have a good organization. You have to have a goal that the public will resonate to. Otherwise, you will never win. Yes? The woman over there, yes.
I'd be interested to hear what you think of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and whether you see that as a way of getting to the rendezvous of victory. Do you think that's the way that we'll get there?
Well, I think there's a kind of mirror image between the BDS movement in its, broadly speaking, because it obviously has different memberships, different constituencies, so we'll just speak broadly speaking, between the BDS movement and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, whatever you think of them, and I think less than zero of them, but the Palestinian Authority, I think its goals are correct. It always talks about international law, international legitimacy, their rights under the law. I think their goals are correct. The problem is their tactics are hopeless. Because as everybody knows, the major asset of the Palestinians is the Palestinian people. If you can mobilize, galvanize 4 million Palestinians, I don't think Israel has a prayer. It could not defeat them. Exactly why it would take me time, but I think most people understand that for themselves. 4 million committed Palestinians, Israel could not stop them. The problem is the so-called leadership will never mobilize them and never organize them because they're afraid, rightfully, that if the Palestinians are mobilized, galvanized, and organized, they'll overthrow the leadership, which is a gang of corrupt collaborators. And so their goal is right, but their tactic is just to go into this room with the Israelis and keep negotiating. Now, I can tell you for a fact, I'm not speaking now from generalities, I read through the entire record over 10 years, 1999 to 2009. The record runs to about 10 to 15,000 pages. It's the Palestine papers. I can tell you without any fear of any contradiction that in those 10 years, 1999 to 2009, Israel never changed its position on anything. nothing happened. Literally nothing happened. The Palestinians assembled what were called matrices, which basically listed all the issues on one side, the Palestinian position in the middle, the Israeli position at the end. You can go through every matrix for 10 years, nothing changed. It was pointless. The wheels of the bus go round and round. The BDS movement, I think its tactics are right. We should use nonviolent forms of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil resistance, boycotts, divestment, sanctions. I think its tactics are completely correct. But they are not clear on their goal. Because the one thing they will never say, and if you're familiar with the movement as I take it you are, they will always say we have a rights-based approach. Fair enough, that sounds right. But they won't mention Israel. They won't say Israel has a right. It is a state. It has its borders. That's part of the law. Now, you know and I know, it's not an accidental omission that they don't mention that part. Because there are many members of the BDS who would prefer if Israel were not there. And there are many people who are very emphatic that Israel shouldn't be there. Now, I am not taking a moral position on that. I'm not going to give you my personal opinion on that. I'm simply going to say it will never fly in the broad public. It's hopeless. And you're not fooling anybody. You say, we want an end to the occupation, we want a full implementation of the right of return, and we want equal rights for Palestinian Arabs in Israel, the rights-based approach. Now, everybody, you don't need a physicist to do the mathematics there. Everyone knows what you're really saying is we want to eliminate Israel. We're not going to say it, but that's what we really need. And that's not going to fly. You have to ask yourselves, don't rely on me. No. You know your neighbors. You know your friends. You know your community. Will a solution which doesn't explicitly recognize Israel's rights as a state, will that persuade your neighbors, friends, and community? No, it's not going to happen. In which case, what are you trying to do? Build a movement or create a couple? I totally support the tactics, but the goal, without the goal, the rightly phrased goal, you'll never get the public. And in which case I have to ask, who are you trying to reach? I want to build a movement. When I was your age, I wasn't in a cult. I was a Maoist. That's right. Chairman Mao. Red in the east, rises the sun, China's brought forth a Mao Zedong. I can give you every slogan. No. And now I look back and I say to myself, I could have taken two routes. My good friend, a couple of you might know him, probably will. Greatest person who Alan Nairn. He was a disciple of Ralph Nader. How many of you know Ralph Nader? Raise your hand. Okay. He worked with all sorts of legislation, seatbelts, Ralph Nader had made it happen. Airbags in cars, Ralph Nader made it happen. And he had a practical impact on the real world, saved literally millions of lives. That's not a joke. Ralph Nader has probably saved the lives of more civilians than any person in the history of the United States with the seatbelts and the airbags. And I was in a cult. I wanted to be pure. Dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't even want to go on. You know, that in itself is enough. I used to sit on the phone, I remember, with Ellen Levy. I would say, Ellen, did you read Althusser and the dictatorship of the proletariat? She said, who cares? I said, what do you mean, who cares? Now, I've graduated from that. I don't see the point of codes. And I do think politics is about exactly what Gandhi said. Trying to reach people where they're at, not where you're at, or where I'm at, where they're at. And I do not believe you can reach a broad public without recognizing Israel as a state. I don't think it can happen.